Welcome to the talk. I might lose my voice a little bit on the way, and I would like to dedicate the fact of that and this talk to Leo Lester, who I had 2 hours discussion with late last night. And yeah, maybe we shouldn't have had that discussion. But I'll try to keep my voice low. I call this talk Good Game, and in this talk we'll be looking into a new type of strategy, or like not a new type of strategy, but like a strategy that is less understood and discussed in the movement at this point, especially compared to the good cop and bad cop strategies. So I think there's going to be a lot of interesting things in this talk for many people in this room, especially people working on corporate campaigns. And I think there's going to be a lot of things you want to like dive deeper into, and this is not going to be able to cover everything like very well. So for sure, this talk will not be able to do full justice to the complexity of the issue. So if you see this something here that's like interesting and stimulating for you, at the end of the talk, I will show a slide with some people from Anima International that I think are very deep into this idea of this approach to corporate campaigns as well, that you can speak with besides me. If you're a regular listener to the Shrimp podcast, as I am, you might already have heard the episode where Louis Bullard came on and discussed interventions in the movement with James. And in this episode, Louis expressed a lot of gratitude for corporate campaigns. He says, "I think we've gotten incredibly lucky in both discovering corporate campaigns on our issue and having advocates who have been able to so skillfully use that tactic." And what is it that Louis is so grateful for? Well, if we look at the track record over the last 10 years on the corporate campaigns, on the corporate cage-free campaigns, for example, we can see that there's a lot of traction on this, as illustrated here in this graph, focusing on the cage-free progress for hens in Europe and the US. And I think when we look back at the decades that came before this, for many countries, like they didn't have anything comparable to this kind of impact when we're looking specifically at suffering reduction of animals. So there's a lot to be grateful for with the corporate campaigns. Open Philanthropy also recently commissioned a case study where Shane Hamilton looked into corporate campaigns history for farmed animals. And in this, he says that even if it's true that we have incredible progress in this, there's also ongoing problems of implementation, enforcement, and accountability. What does it mean? It means companies have routinely agreed to a welfare standard, publicly committed to it, and then proceeded to do little or nothing to implement the reform. So this is a problem that we face. And he's saying these ongoing challenges, they highlight the necessity and value of continuous strategic innovation in the field. Let's have a look at a graph here trying to illustrate how the ecosystem of corporate campaigns is often thought of as. I think historically most groups in this room have at one point, maybe they are still at this moment, thinking of themselves as a good cop or a bad cop, following good cop strategy or bad cop strategy. What does it mean? Well, if we think of companies as entities that have their goals, that have strategies, that have objectives, and as a result of this, they have a lot of incentives. If you are an organization that wants to create a change for this company, you can respond to different incentives. So on the left side here in this illustration where the good cop roams, you can see that this is the strategy that is focusing on the incentives related to creating positive value. And you do this through collaboration often. The compromise here, or like the way that the good cop is positioned to build this relationship, is that it limits itself in terms of how much will it escalate in terms of campaigning. On the other hand, you have the bad cop strategy, or the bad cop. And this is the opposite, right? This is the strategy that is focused on the negative incentives, or like the incentives a company has responding to, for instance, public pressure, public outreach. So this is a more negative value proposition that it's offering. And again, like the compromise here from being able to like escalate so far into campaigns is that there's a limit to how deep relationship, how much trust can you build with the companies. This is how I think like it's often perceived. And it's interesting because as you see in this illustration, you can think of these as two specializations. There's very little overlap in this illustration between the good cop and the bad cop. At the same time, they are seen as like having supporting roles in an ecosystem where the ecosystem is optimizing for the same objective and applying two different strategies at the same time. So let's take a look at the good cop. So as I said, focuses on the incentives where the company stands to gain value. This can be things related to gaining like brand image, increasing the brand image of the corporation. Can also be related to clearing various roadblocks the company might face, can remove friction, can reduce conflict. One of the advantages of this position is that it can often handle high volume of companies because it doesn't have to go into escalation of campaigns. But at the same time, impact is often slower. And the good cop will often or can often be perceived as a pushover because it has this limited leverage over the companies. There's a limit to how much it will escalate into campaigns. On the other hand, we have the bad cop. So focuses on the incentives where the company stands to lose value. And this can, to a large degree, be thought of as like introducing friction. Like if you can identify the goals and the strategies of a company, you can design your strategies to cause friction for the company like this way and make it not worth it for them to not implement or not commit to like what you're trying to get out of them. So the bad cop has like very strong like value proposition. There's direct consequences right now if you don't move on this topic that we want you to move on. There can be campaigning. And this can in many cases lead to action being driven much faster, sometimes, because it can also have the opposite effect. There's this dynamic of short-term compliance where a company can simply commit to something primarily to get the campaign to go away. And this is a big issue right now, for example. Campaigns are also heavy lifting. Anybody who's been in a sustained campaign in the organization knows that campaigns can be like very, very heavy lifting. So there's more limitation to like how many companies can you actually take on with a campaign at the same time. And of course, the bad cop risks burning bridges and lose access to information. And if it's willing to escalate so far into the most extreme tactics, it can also push outside social norms, so it can lose support from the public. So I tried to create like a few very simplified, very theoretical models to kind of like illustrate a couple of points and dynamics. So out on the x-axis, you can think of this as the players. You have the good cop, the bad cop, and a company. On the y-axis, you have influence. And think of this influence as the influence that the good and the bad cop are able to produce. And from the company's perspective, think of it as the influence required to get them to do the thing we want them to do. So in this situation, we can think of this as a foie gras campaign. So we're trying to get a foie gras-free ask from a small restaurant chain. And in this situation, the good cop and the bad cop are both independent of each other. They don't need ecosystem in this situation. They have enough influence over the company to reach the objective. So imagine that this is a cage-free policy instead. Now this is more complicated. Maybe it's more costly. Maybe there's more problems in the supply chain, etc. And in this situation, neither the good cop or the bad cop have enough influence on its own to produce enough influence to get the objective achieved. But because they're part of the same ecosystem, the ecosystem is optimizing for the same thing. We can think of it as the ecosystem being able to produce enough influence over the company, and we can reach the objective. I think this graph is more like the situation, like if we dial back 10, 15 years, maybe 5 even, I think for many countries, this is more what the challenge looked like when they started to look at cage-free policies from very big players like supermarkets or food manufacturers or other sort of like large companies. And clearly in this situation, the ecosystem is not able to produce enough influence to get the commitment or to get the win. So what happens? Well, like we have innovation, right? And I think especially the bad cop innovated back in this situation. And what did they do? Like I would say they picked from Zelensky's rule number 3, go outside the experience of an opponent. And what was this experience? Hyper-aggressive pressure campaigns. This innovation, especially from the bad cops, as well as some more like funding flowing into the ecosystem, more people joining, but especially like these hyper-aggressive pressure campaigns, this innovation, like in a very short period of time, dramatically increased the influence that the ecosystem had over the companies. Oops. And so clearly in like this situation, the combined innovation from funding and on tactics and skills coming into the ecosystem, we were now able to start to win much more difficult campaigns. And you can kind of like think of this from two perspectives then, this innovation. What happened? Like in one scenario, you can think of it as being locked in. It got locked in as like permanent knowledge and skills, experience, like we won over a lot of companies, and it built up as like confidence and skills. But was it really like truly locked in a permanent way? Like did we really consistently manage to build the influence over the companies in a consistent way? Let's assume that we did. Even if this is the case, the companies are not passive bystanders. Like they adapt to the situation. So like even if the innovation is permanently locked into the ecosystem, the companies will adapt. And if they do this successfully, they can increase the bar for like how much influence is required to win the next thing. But there's also a different scenario where like this innovation is not really like locked into the ecosystem. And I would say the more the innovation relies on surprise and shock effect and maybe perception of power, the more this is the case, the harder it can be hit in the adaptation phase. Because not only are the companies adapting themselves, increasing their own tactics, they also in this process can devaluate how much influence does these organizations actually hold over us. So depending on like which scenario you believe is true, it can create a dynamic where the animal advocacy movement might have one perception of the influence that we have over the companies, and the companies might have another perception of this influence. And this creates risk if they have the belief that we now have much less influence than we believe, then there can be credibility loss as we go out and threaten with campaigns because the companies might not fear them as much as they used to. I think it's useful to kind of like think about this dynamic from the perspective of playing games together. And it would be really great if we could all play this amazing board game that I made up called Uncaged. This is a collaborative board game with the objective of getting hens out of cages all over the world as fast as possible. And it would be great if we could just play this game with companies from all over the world with this joint objective of getting hens out of cages. And there are some companies that are interested in playing this game with us. There are some companies that really value animal welfare so much that they want to play this game with us. But most companies are not that interested in this collaborative game. Maybe it's too expensive, maybe it's too complicated. They don't want to do it. They don't see enough value in doing it. And so we end up having to play a different game because what do they care about? They do care about like public perception, for instance. So we end up having to play another game that I made up called Cage-Free Campaign. And this game is very different from Uncaged. This is a highly competitive game. So in this game, the different players have very different objectives in the game. There's different win conditions. And we're struggling with them. Like we're fighting to win this game. There's only like one winner often in this situation. Now, if we think of this as a game that we as a movement invented ourselves, like we wrote the rules, we know all the strategies, we know every single action card that can be played in this game. It's clear when new players join this game, when companies come and play with us for the first time, we are a great advantage. We know like everything that can happen in the game, and the company can be surprised on many occasions. Problem is that as in any board game that you start playing like the third and fourth and fifth and sixth time, you get better at it. You start understanding what are the game mechanics, how does the rules work, what are the strategies. And not only do you get better at like the specific game, you also start developing your own strategies for the game. So what are these strategies that the companies can develop? Well, they can develop strategies such as all talk, no action. They can work to create the appearance that something is going on. We're working on something, progress is happening. In reality, nothing is really happening. They can develop strategies about dragging out implementation as much as possible. This is now their goal of the game. Drag out implementation as far as entirely possible. Or create like an appearance again of like the roadblocks out in the world being so hard to overcome that it's unreasonable for them to even try to do it. And we can look at it from the perspective then of like the good cop. Like how does the good cop fail in this game? Well, first of all, if it doesn't have any real value proposition, if it can't offer the company anything of value in the first place and also won't escalate, it's going to fail. It has nothing to give to the company. But the good cop can also fail if it ends up being manipulated by these strategies of the company, if it ends up being played by the strategies of the companies. And this can be very bad for the ecosystem when it happens. And I think we see like specific situations of this at times when a good cop can almost become a bodyguard for the company. So specific example, for instance, like reaching out to company that is clearly not doing what it's supposed to do. It's clearly falling behind. There's no progress for years and years. And the company kind of like uses this explanation. We have chosen to only work with one stakeholder. Therefore, we don't have to engage with you. And in that situation, like the good cop creates failure in the ecosystem because it's getting played by the company and the ecosystem can't pull like its weight. Companies can also use other strategies, like they can specialize in strategies to avoid making commitments in the first place, to repel campaigns, make campaigns go away, like just sustain them. And they can develop strategies related to appearing to commit to something with no real understanding of or like intention ever to committing to it, but as a strategy to make like the campaign go away. So again, like how does the bad cop fail in this game? Well, if it has no real value proposition, if it can't create anything of enough value for the company, can't win campaigns, it's going to fail like that. But it will also fail if it's going to end up accepting commitments that it really has no reason to believe will be implemented. It's another way it can fail. And again, it can escalate so far beyond social norms that it loses too much support from the public. So in summary, I see two problems with these strategies. On the one hand, like it requires a functional ecosystem. I think good cop, bad cop, framework, strategies, when they work, no doubt about it. I'm not a hater, I love it, it's good. But like look at Europe, for instance, like what do we have? 40 countries in Europe, like corporate campaigns, will it require 80 functional organizations in Europe to do corporate campaigns? Of course, you have like global players as well. You have organizations that operate in multiple countries. But that's usually for like global targets, like what when you get down on the ground and have to work with the national targets, like does it really require a functional ecosystem? And I think most people here in this room are probably not in a functional ecosystem like in their country. And that might be because you are the only group that are doing corporate outreach. Well, by definition, you're not in an ecosystem. But there can be like other organizations in your country as well that are working on this. And so you have like what appears to be an ecosystem. But as we just saw in the previous slides, like good cop and bad cop can fail for whatever reasons. And if one of these cops fail in the ecosystem, well, there is no ecosystem in that situation. And that could be like many types of coordination problems in this situation as well. I think there's another issue here related to credibility that I think is closer connected to this kind of like idea of like specialization into specific strategies. And I think there can be a risk of new people and new groups kind of like end up almost role-playing these strategies. It's like, what does a good cop do? What does a bad cop do? Therefore, I will do this. Kind of like looking up in the manual, like what is required to execute this strategy, and you checklist it instead of like really sitting down and looking like, here's a company that I'm going to work with. Like, what are the incentives of this company? What will they respond to? And developing your own, like from first principles analysis, like your own strategy on like what is required to win this specific campaign in my context. I think there's also like a deeper underlying problem here. It's more speculative for me, but if we are really like totally dedicated animal activists, like we dedicated our lives to this cause, like we want to see an end to cages. And we're coming to the companies and we're saying like, there's a moral imperative. It's uniquely moral imperative. Like you need to go cage free. I think there can be something inauthentic, like from the company's perspective with the meeting of somebody who's following like either a bad cop or a good cop strategy. Because like, if you meet a good cop in this situation as a company, and this good cop will tell you, you know, like after you realize like, okay, I can just like keep talking with this company and like what's gonna happen. You see like the worst thing like this good cop will do to you is to give you fewer points in a ranking. If that's like the worst thing they will do to you, I think there's something there like related to authenticity or credibility. It's like, is this really like what you mean? Like, is this like the most you will do, being totally dedicated to this issue? And at the same time, like in the meeting with the bad cop, I think you can also have this dynamic where you have a company and they're like, okay, I understand that we need to make progress here. I accept that it's an issue we need to work on, but here's some roadblocks that I see. Here's some challenges that I have. And I think if the attitude from like the bad cop is like, that sounds like a you problem, better fix it or else, I think that can also be something like very like inauthentic in that it's like, if you really mean this, if you really want to solve it, like, why don't you want to help me with task X, but only do task Y? Okay, hold that thought on credibility for a moment, and let's talk about how to win in the greatest board game of all time, Twilight Imperium. So Twilight Imperium is an amazing game, and it's famous for its richness in complexity and strategies and amazing game mechanics, and also like enormous need for diplomacy in this game. It's also infamous for the rule book actually being a book, and this game can easily last 12 to 18 hours for a single game. So this creates like a hard fork for people. They either absolutely hate it or they absolutely love it. It's quite a small group of people who really love it. And like the effect of this is that most people who love this game, they will end up playing many games with each other. They'll end up playing like over the years, like 10, 20, 30 games with each other. So they get very used to each other. And this creates interesting dynamic, right? Because in order to win this game, it's not enough to really like master the rules and the strategies. You also now need to be very concerned about your reputation, because what you do in one game carries over to the next game. You have a reputation with the people that you regularly play with, and if you backstab somebody in one game, this is not going to be forgotten in the next game. You have a reputation. Are you a person that follows the word? Do you follow through on your threats or not? So now it creates a dynamic where reputation becomes incredibly important if you want to play this game long term. So in this game, credibility is currency. So what gives you credibility in this game? Or like, how do you lose credibility in this game? Well, if you give empty threats, if you break your promises, if you lie, if you don't play fair, and if you violate the norms of this gaming group, these things are gonna lower your credibility. And you gain the credibility when you can give very precise threats and follow through on them. When you honor agreements, you play fair, you uphold the game norms, and win games. It gives you credibility. And it creates an interesting question now, because it's like the question, what is the optimal move for you as a player? This now depends on whether you're playing for the single round, for the game, or for all future games. So if you're a dedicated Twilight Imperium player, you might want to lose the round. You might even want to lose the game if your reputation is at stake. If you committed yourself to threatening another player who you feel did something to you they shouldn't have done, if you threaten them like, I'm gonna fuck you up in this game, and you back out of it, how are they gonna fear you in the next game? So in this situation, for like the hardcore nerds, they're willing to throw an entire game for 18 hours. They're willing to throw it just to protect their reputation. Reputation is everything if you play long term. And I think in corporate campaigns, we are also playing long term, and we need to think from long term perspective. And it's not the first time that we realize that we are not optimizing for long term. I think many people in this room are in organizations that at either one point in the past or now face internal problems because they optimize too much for short-term goals. That can mean like starting new campaigns, hiring too many people, and if you didn't get the foundation right, all these things might have helped you temporarily, but now you're in trouble. And I think we've all been there, and some of us probably like are still there. And in the same way with like talent pipelines, even if you have gotten like very solid foundation, now many groups have problems attracting talent to the organization. So they also didn't prioritize long-term talent acquisition. Like, how do we make sure that there's a constant stream of like activists that's joining a movement that becomes like great people to recruit from, like the next people who can go out and do amazing campaigns. And in the same sense, like this is my opinion, I think in the corporate campaigns, we also didn't optimize enough for long-term credibility. So this finally brings me to the alternative strategy. And I think there's like many groups that have kind of like moved in this direction for many years. So it's not like, for some people, there's not like anything novel in it. They'll just be like, yeah, this is campaigning. But I think there's still some like added value in what I will cover next. So this approach uses the framework of fairness to be able to cover a broader spectrum of tactics between what is considered the two specialized strategies of good cop and bad cop. And there's kind of like two reasons why you would end up here. And it relates to the problems I pointed to in the previous slide. So if you're not in a functional ecosystem, does it make any sense to think of you as following like a good cop or a bad cop strategy? I think it doesn't make much sense in that situation. But it can also be that groups, and I think this is what happened, like many groups, they were not in this ecosystem, so they got moved more into this like wider approach, and they just started liking it. They just started like mastering this, becoming like much better at like this specific approach. And now I think there's like people who applied it for a long time that say like, I probably wouldn't go back to focusing on a good cop, bad cop framework. I think this is actually more effective. It optimizes more for long-term credibility for me. But those are like two reasons for why you can get there. So what's this fairness about and fair play? What's the point with fairness and fair play? I think everybody here has like, they're in cultures where fairness plays like a big role. Like fairness is like very widespread. It's everywhere in society, the idea of fairness. And it's not like hard to understand why. Like there's been selection for fairness. Like how do we create more complex social groups? Well, we need to have fairness between us in order to organize ourselves in more complex societies. And it spills over today to the extent that the people who's perceived as playing fair, they have advantages. They gain more trust. It's easier for them to make allies. They can get access to social capital. We can also see it like how fairness has really like spread fully across like all competitive sports. There's no competitive sports that doesn't have the concept of fair play. And it's interesting to understand that fair play is about more than just the game itself. People who are considered very fair players, it transcends into like how they are perceived as individuals also outside the game. That's why we have memes in societies, for instance, of like, you know, there's this like famous marathon, like, and just like 200 meters before the finish line, like the guy turns the wrong direction and the other guy could just take over and win the game, but he stops, he refuses. He takes the guy back and says like, hey, goal line is over here, and he guides him through. And this transcends like this person to a meme in society. He's celebrated because he cares about something that's bigger than winning. Like he cares about the fairness of winning. He will not take a win that wasn't fair. His love for the game is too big. So I think it gives you something as like how reliable you are as a partner when you play fair. It's also good to understand that playing fair has nothing to do with being soft. Like it depends on the game that you're playing. If I'm dumb enough to challenge Aaron Ross to a boxing match and I get a bloody nose as a result, I still need to shake hands with him afterwards and say like, good game. Like we agreed on the terms for the game we're gonna play now. So like you can do like very bad things to your opponent, whether that is destroying their bases in StarCraft or going into the ring or otherwise like competing in things that are not in ways that are not very nice. And it's still a good game. It's still considered fair play because people understand what are the premises of what we are doing. So I think it kind of like establishes maybe a position here that we can think of as the fair cop. And I don't know if it's useful to stay in the cop analogy, but I'm going to do it here anyway, just to kind of like explain the position. So this approach relies on being perceived as fair by the other players in the game. And if it is perceived as fair, it is able to spread out across the tactics between the two specific strategies as illustrated here. So you can think of it as this kind of like being a bad cop that's moving more to the left. And in that process, it has to limit itself. There's something in the tactics that it cuts off because these tactics are simply too often not considered fair enough in the situation. But it also can't go full into collaboration. There is a limit to how deep it can go into building relationships and trust with the companies due to being willing to escalate. So I think there's kind of like 2 points here in terms of credibility that works out for the fair cop. The fair cop will start out exploring the potential for the negotiations for like a win-win solution. And in this process, it has no such thing as that's not my job. Like, it's really serious about looking at all the possible roadblocks, whatever. It will seriously consider, should I take on this work? Should I try to solve this coordination problem? And I think it builds credibility with the companies. At the same time, it can't be pushed over. Like, it will escalate very far into campaigning if no action is going to come, if the company is backing off from its promises, if it's not making any progress, it is going to go far into escalation. So this creates like this question now, like, how can you build both relationships with companies and escalate far into campaigns at the same time? Like, how can you do both at the same time? Let's look a bit closer at the approach of the fair cop. So as I said, it starts out by exploring the potential for the incentives where the company stands to gain value. In this process, it uses benefit of doubt, but it tests for sincerity. And these tests for sincerity are crucial. And this is one of the hardest things about this approach, probably, because you need to be able to do a litmus test. You need to be able to do a verification test on the claims from the companies in order to avoid getting into these scenarios where there's promises for the future and you don't see any progress on this. So you need to be able to provide a lot of tests along the way to check how sincere is the company. Is it like, are they going to actually do what they follow through with? Or like, are they going to follow through with what they say? Why should I believe your next step is around the corner? What can you show me? It's a very patient negotiator in this situation. And this is extremely important as well, because the patience, if there is skill and patience, and you can actually build a good relationship with companies, there is a relationship between what are the options, like how big is the potential for finding an amicable solution. This relies on your ability to build relationship with the companies. The better relationship you can build with the company, the more potential to find an amicable solution. This means that the fair cop approaches these situations as a reluctant campaigner. So with reluctant campaigner, we understand an organization that makes it clear that it's like, we are a campaigning organization. We will campaign if it's needed, but this is clearly not a preference. We would very much prefer that we didn't have to escalate into this. So that's kind of like 2 rules of Fight Club for the fair cop. Rule number 1, we prefer not to fight. Rule number 2, we will fight you if required. So in this situation, it has to avoid bluffing and instead be quite focus a lot on transparency instead. I'll get back to this point on the next slide. I have more to say about it. The fair cop is very careful to only pick the battles it can win, because it needs to commit itself to winning in these situations, because it's obsessed with long-term credibility. Losing a campaign, backing out of a campaign is very, very expensive for the reputation of the player. One way to deal with this is to think of campaigning as something that is not different from corporate outreach. Everything is campaigning. And campaigning is gradual. It escalates gradual. And I think there's many organizations here that realize that there's a lot of things you can do that escalates gradually into campaign without you having to commit to a public pressure campaign. You can create a lot of negative value for the company in this process before you commit yourself to something that you either win or have to back out of. So escalation is something that needs to be seen within the fairness principle for this COP. Like, this is a key point about this position, that there are other players observing this. Like, this is not just about like your interaction with a single company. All the other companies are also playing this game, and they are observing this move. If you're not a reliable player in that move with the one company, this can be observed by other companies. Maybe not in the moment, but over the years, conferences, companies talk together. There is an observer to how you act with these companies. So you need to be thinking about, in this situation, if you want to take this fair cop approach, like, how am I perceived? How is this perceived from the other companies that I'm going to have to work with? You can't just be focusing on like whether this seems justified to you or whether it's justified to the company, which often, of course, like they will feel it's not justified. You have to think about it. Does it seem like fair play from the other companies that's observing this campaign that's going on? So how can we do it? There's no such thing as fair play principles for campaigning. But as I said, there is fair play principles for many other things in society, in competitive games, in competitive sports. We have quite well-developed principles here. So I think by trying to apply fair play principles from sports into campaigning, there can be some at least beneficial ways of thinking how can we be perceived as fair when we escalate into campaigns. Of course, fair play differs from context to context. What is perceived as fair in my wealthy liberal democracy of Denmark is going to be very different of like what is perceived as fair play in a total different part of the world, total different context. Still, there's a concept of fairness and fair play. But of course, like fair play is not one thing. You need to be able to understand what is fairness, what is fair play in this situation. I'll take a look at a couple of these to elaborate on them. The first one, follow the rules. What does it mean? Well, the first mistake, the rules are not the laws. In my situation, like in many people's situation here in this room, the game rules are liberal democracy. So that means, can we do things ever that break the law and still be considered a fair play? Yes, we can. And I think like to mention like a few examples here, like investigations, for instance, like if your investigation reveals something that is truly shocking to majority of society, and there's no other way that the public could have gotten access to this information, and this is very consequential for public perception of, for instance, fox industry, this can be perceived as fair even if it involves breaking laws. Civil disobedience, same situation. There are types of civil disobedience that will technically or that will like be breaking the laws, but from public perception or from the player's perspective, it can be seen as justified. So it depends on the context. On the other hand, just because something is legal, it doesn't mean that it's fair. So I have example here from Denmark from back in the days when we decided to run a cage-free campaign against very, very small company. A company that had like one outlet, very famous bakery, 150-year-old bakery. And this was chosen because it's like, this is smart, like this, everybody knows this name. If we have campaign against them, it's gonna be great. Like we're gonna get a lot of attention on this. But it backlashed because it was perceived as disproportional. Like, how do you have like 5 activists like protesting this one like bakery store? Turns out they didn't have that much cage eggs, if they even had any cage eggs in the first place. It's like, it becomes disproportional. And I think like some groups here in this room also have this experience of doing things that are perceived as disproportional. I can see Ivos is laughing. So proportionality is important aspect here. I think maybe one of like the greatest examples from newer times is L214's flip campaign. I don't know how many of you here are aware about the flip campaign. If you're not, you need to study it. So L214 were in a broiler campaign for an ECC commitment with the French producer LDC. This was a very long campaign. It lasted 4 years. They stuck with it. They won it. Congratulations to L214, great organization. This specific action was interesting because L214 created an action that was so engaging that it involved hundreds of people in society. And it was very, very, very simple action. The idea was simply that you would get people to flip every single LDC product in the supermarkets. So you would be in the supermarkets and you would look at products, oh, there's all these brands, and all of a sudden, wall of blue. And like they created an app for this, so people could download an app and they could track how many LDC products have I flipped today. So okay, I can see I only have a few minutes left. I need to speed it up a bit. They managed to flip more than 100,000 packages in the end. And I think like the question of like, is this legal or not? It becomes less interesting because in this situation, it's perceived as very cool and fun and engaging. Play honestly. Interesting tweet from Paul Graham here. I support jail terms for protesters who deface famous art to get attention. They're cheating. They're taking advantage of a feature of high trust societies, art displayed publicly in museums and violating that trust. It's interesting, right? Like he's pointing to something here, saying like they're cheating, they're hacking, it's not honest. They're using the fact that we are in high trust society to do something that in theory anyone could do it, but they choose to do it. So Paul Graham is calling it out and saying it's cheating. This is one way to think about honesty. Honesty can also be understood related to transparency with the companies. And I think there are many benefits to transparency. It can build credibility with you in the situation. There's an interesting idea about costly signaling theory. It's related to like the peacock, like the big tail, like why does it have the big tail? According to costly signaling theory, having a big tail is a big disadvantage for you. You're gonna be much easier to be caught by the predators. So the bigger tail, the more disadvantage you have. So the fact that you are alive as an individual signals that you're a strong individual. In the same sense, if you are in a corporate negotiation and things are starting to escalate into, like you can see, like we're not gonna be able to find a amicable solution, this is gonna go into campaigns. You having like a very good take on like, what is this campaign actually gonna look like, instead of saying like, we're gonna destroy you. If your take is like, this is gonna be hard, like this is really like saddening me that it's going in this direction, this can be a very, very difficult campaign for us to win. We might have to invest 3-4 years into this in order to secure it. That's costly. Like you're giving the company information here in that situation that they can use against you. But at the same time, you're also showing like strength. It's like you are a person that can afford giving the company this situation. This illustrates how serious you are. You will follow through with this. Respect opponents. Can you do executive targeting while doing it with dignity? Sure, you can. This situation where we did executive targeting at a company, we used more satire in the situation. The staff members ended up like laughing, taking selfies with it, like they wanted to have this sign afterwards to put it inside their store, and we won them over a little bit to our cause, which was the goal with that specific action. Don't trash talk. When you do the call to actions, we always ask people to be polite. If somebody violated, if you see evidence of this with the company, you recognize it, saying like, that's not good. And I think that's generally like this. Like, if you think less about the individual people as somebody who's evil, like in the system, and think more about like them being in a game, it can help you in the situation. I'm gonna speed up a bit here. Be consistent, like, are we really setting the same standards for ourselves as we are for the companies when we require transparency and accuracy and truth-seeking? Can we really say that we have that same standard for ourselves in our interaction with them? If not, it will not be perceived as fair play. And I think there's this like constant temptation for short-term gains in this situation, because great campaigners, they identify all the glitches, all the hacks, etc. And there's this constant temptation to take them. But if you're playing long-term, it can be negative for you. So you have to be principled if you want to be perceived as fair. And you want to be accurate. Like you don't want to like have the company find out something that you told about them that they didn't know already, like from the media, from another company. The companies are not playing fair, you could say, right? Like, why should we play fair like when they don't play fair? Or like how do you deal with it in that situation? From sports, like it's not like there are bad faith players, like there are people that don't play fair. So like what do you do in this situation? First of all, like you want to check, like, is that really like malice or stupidity? Like, was that a mistake or was that a conscious malice move from the player? You want to give that benefit of doubt. But when you see it, like you want to call it out. Like you want to say, like, from my perspective, what I'm seeing now, this doesn't sound consistent. This is starting to sound like bullshit to me. Like, you have to call it out. And you can stay composed in that situation and still clarify the consequences of like, what's the direction that's going here. And you can escalate it in sense. You can escalate it inside the company. You can escalate it in society. But if you focus on protecting the culture of this game, you can like gain credibility points over time, even though it might be worse in the specific situation. So wrapping up, fair cop strategy, it's a blessing and a curse. Like, it removes some aspects of the tactics. It cuts off like tactics at both ends in order to be able to fill out the spectrum in between. At the same time, like, I think it allows organizations to explore a lot more in like the gray areas around, like closer to the edges or around the middle. I think there's tendency to kind of like say like, these are the best pressure tactics. These are the best negotiation tactics or like win-win tactics. And then you apply kind of like the best of them. And there's not much exploration for the rest of the field. So like the fair cop kind of like have to explore more here. There's also no playbook. There's less plug and play here that you can do. So you're faced in many situations with more like first principle problems, or you have to take like more first principle problems to the solutions, because like the fair cop needs to look at the thing it wants to do and say like apply on top of it, like how is this going to be perceived by the other companies? So it forces you into this more like first ordered thinking. That's more time requiring, that takes more resources, etc. But I think actually like the people who end up like having to be more in this kind of like fair cop framework, they are also the organizations where the most innovation is coming from. And it's interesting, right? Because it makes sense. The more you have to take first principle way of thinking about problems, the more you're likely to come up with unique solutions to them, because you don't do plug and play. So, and that's probably like very important, right? Developing innovation. Here's a bunch of people that don't have that many friends here at the conference, because they spend a lot of time thinking about corporate outreach and campaigns. So you can talk with them besides me. We'll all be happy to discuss with you. And yeah, that sums it up.
Thank you, Jan, for the fantastic talk. And I personally found it super inspiring to think of campaigning as like from this game framework. We don't have that much time for Q&A, but we will try to squeeze in a few questions. We have a question from Sharon, which is, thank you. It is difficult to approach politics as a fair game. Our adversaries will never be fair. How do you think about this?
I think it's a good question. And as I said, like, I don't think that good cop, bad cop should not be used. Like, I don't think like this framework should never be used. It could be that there are situations where it doesn't make sense to have fair play approach, because the game is rigged. Like, the game you're playing is just rigged by definition. And if this is the case, maybe it doesn't make sense to have this fair cop approach. I think it's good question. I haven't thought that much about it from the perspective of politics. Maybe there's somebody who will have a better answer than me.
Next up, question from Paul. Is it possible for an organization that has historically been a bad cop to change and become a fair cop? Or sometimes are the bridges forever burned?
I don't think they are forever burned. Like, I think the process, because I would say like all the groups in Anima International have like moved from probably being in like very bad cop framework to moving into fair cop. And for Anima's case, like in Denmark, for instance, this was a process that took a long time, because Anima was primarily known as like a group that would do investigations that in general just couldn't be, like negotiated much with, and that probably had like very unrealistic demands or claims on the world. And that took years for us to kind of like move into this fair cop approach and build the credibility with all the stakeholders in society. I don't know. That's probably things that you've done in the past that will make it very, very difficult. But I don't think it's impossible for anyone to get there.
Now, question from Cyril. By choosing to only pick battles you can win, don't you make your organization too risk averse? What's a can win? Is it 90% chance of winning or 50% of winning?
Yeah, nice question. I think it also depends on like how you define the win, and I think it's like one should also understand that the purpose of a specific campaign can be as much about creating leverage like in all the other situations. And you can approach like these situations where you feel you're getting stuck, like there's many different ways to approach it. I think maybe it's less appropriate to talk about it here, but there are like ways to approach it. But of course you can never be 100% confident that you will win, but I think you also can't like emphasize the importance of really taking serious like the risk of losing campaigns. So this is why I say like we want to only move into campaigns that we believe we can win, because like losing or like pulling away from campaigns is so expensive. But of course you're never gonna have like 100% and 90% conviction that you'll be able to win the campaign. But I think it also like I see much more movement now in terms of like defining winning more precise. I mean, like at one point we said like getting commitments is winning, and then we're like, okay, but that's not winning. Like getting the commitments implemented, like that's when we win. So I think I can also create like dynamic where you focus much more on like short-term improvements in the companies, like getting from 10 to 40% implementation. That's like a massive win. And I see like many groups starting to look at this more not from the perspective of like, why do we like focus so much on like whether a specific company has 100% policy? Why are we not focusing on whether the supply is growing? And I think this kind of like gives you this concept of like, let's focus on how to grow, how to change the industry as fast as possible instead of focusing only on the companies. And from that perspective, it can make sense that you set win criteria that are related to specific thresholds for like when the company has implemented to a certain degree, this is your winning threshold, and you move on and you get the other companies to do it.
We are unfortunately out of time, which is a pity because we have a lot of excellent questions waiting.
Good luck for me, because I could hardly answer any of these.
But feel free to try to catch Jan around the conference, ask him more questions. I'm sure he will be very happy to talk to you. Please also take care of your throat and restore your voice. Thank you everyone for attending. Please make sure to rate the session in the inventory app. And thank you once more, Jan, for delivering this fantastic lecture.
Thank you so much. It's just us.